Imagine being the most desired woman on the planet. Your face on every magazine cover, your name on every set of lips. Strangers screaming for you from behind velvet ropes, flashbulbs exploding like lightning every time you step outside, rooms going quiet when you walk in, conversations stopping mid-sentence just because you exist. Now imagine going home that night to an empty house. No one waiting, no one to hold, no one who truly knows who you are beneath the smile, the platinum hair, and the shimmering dress. A phone that rings and rings, and the calls you most desperately need to make going unanswered. That was the life of Marilyn Monroe. On the morning of August 5, 1962, a housekeeper at a quiet Brentwood home in Los Angeles noticed something wrong. The light in the master bedroom had been on all night. The door was locked. There was no answer when she knocked. She called the psychiatrist. He arrived, broke open the bedroom window, and found Marilyn Monroe lying face down on her bed. A telephone was still in her hand. Empty pill bottles were scattered across the nightstand.
She was 36 years old.
The news broke across the world within hours. Newspapers stopped their presses. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. In cities from New York to Paris to Tokyo, people felt something difficult to name, a grief that seemed to reach beyond celebrity, beyond movie screens, into something far more personal. As if the world had lost something it hadn't even realized it was holding on to. But here is what the headlines never told you. The part that decades of private letters, therapy recordings, declassified FBI files, and testimony from those closest to her have slowly and painfully revealed. The story of how Marilyn Monroe died did not begin on that August night. It began in a Los Angeles orphanage. It grew inside the relentless machinery of Hollywood fame, and it was shaped by the hands of powerful men who saw her not as a human being, but as a product, a property, an image to be packaged, exploited, and then quietly discarded when the inconvenience of her humanity became too much to manage. This is the full story, not the mythology, not the icon, the real woman, and the world that built her and then broke her. And it is far more devastating than anything the world was told at the time. Her real name was Norma Jean Mortensen. She came into the world on June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles, and from the very first day the world made it clear it wasn't sure what to do with her. She never knew her father. His identity remained a mystery her entire life, a void where other children had something solid, a question mark where there should have been an answer. The absence shaped her in ways that are almost impossible to fully measure. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, worked as a film negative cutter at a Hollywood studio. She spent her days in the buildings where glamour was manufactured and sold, handling the physical material of movies, the actual film strips that projected dreams onto screens. And yet she lives as far from glamour as a person could live. Gladys suffered from severe mental illness, most likely paranoid schizophrenia. Before Norma Jean was old enough to form memories, her mother was being taken away to psychiatric institutions. And so began a childhood that would leave a mark that nothing, not fame, not money, not the love of millions of strangers, would ever fully erase. She was passed between foster families, strangers' homes, church charity arrangements. By the time she was 10 years old, she had lived in 12 different houses. Some families were kind, some were cold. Some were cruel in ways she would only speak about obliquely, in guarded fragments, for the rest of her life. In at least one home she suffered abuse that should never happen to any child anywhere. The shape of what she endured was visible in everything she said and didn't say about it in later years. But the wound that defined everything, the wound that would reach forward into every relationship, every desperate act of love-seeking, every collapse, came not from any single act of cruelty, but from a quiet institutional fact. Despite having a mother who was technically alive and breathing in the world, Norma Jean was placed in the Los Angeles orphans' home. Think about what that meant to a child trying to make sense of the world. Her mother existed, and yet here was the little girl in an orphanage. Having a mother hadn't been enough. The mother couldn't stay. Love, in her experience, always arrived with conditions attached that she couldn't meet and didn't understand. That reality planted something inside her that therapy, success, and even genuine love from decent people would spend decades trying to reach. The deep cellular conviction that she was at some fundamental level unkeepable, that sooner or later everyone would find a reason to put her somewhere and walk away. She would lie in that orphanage at night, staring at the ceiling, and make herself a private promise. One day, the whole world would know her name. One day, she would matter so much that nobody could pretend not to see her. She kept that promise. The price she paid for keeping it is everything that follows. A woman named Grace McKee eventually became her unofficial guardian and brought genuine warmth into her life, the first consistent maternal presence Norma Jean had ever known. But circumstances changed, as circumstances always seem to change around her. When Grace could no longer provide a home, a practical solution was arranged with a minimum of difficulty and a maximum of speed. At 16 years old, Norma Jean married a 21-year-old neighborhood acquaintance named James Doherty. It was not a love story, it was an administrative solution, a way to avoid another transfer, another intake form, another strange room with a stranger smell. And for a teenager who had been passed from hand to hand since birth, saying yes was simply what she had learned to do when the alternative was being passed again. She had never once felt securely loved. She had no model for what a healthy relationship felt like, no template for trust, no experience of an attachment that simply stayed without requiring performance in return. And somewhere beneath the cheerful compliance she had mastered as a survival tool, she already suspected, because she had been right every single time, that this one wouldn't stay either. She was right. But what came next was something no foster family, no orphanage intake officer, and no hastily arranged marriage had prepared her for. Something was about to wake up inside Norma Jean Mortensen. And once awake, it would never, ever go back to sleep. While James Doherty was overseas serving in World War II, Norma Jean found work on an assembly line at a munitions factory in Van Nuys, California. She was 18 years old, inspecting parachutes and folding military equipment for hours at a stretch, in a building full of noise and women doing the same repetitive work day after day. One afternoon, a photographer named David Conover arrived at the factory on an army assignment, shooting images of women contributing to the war effort, morale photography, propaganda essentially dressed up as celebration. His camera moved down the assembly line. When it reached Norma Jean, it stopped. He photographed her that day and came back to photograph her again. He later said there was something in the lens when she appeared in it, a quality he found almost impossible to describe. She didn't just look good in photographs, she came alive in them. As if the two-dimensional plane of a photograph was, paradoxically, the most real place she had ever existed. She began pursuing modeling seriously. She approached agency after agency and was told repeatedly that she wasn't quite right. Her hair was the wrong shade. Her measurements were close but not perfect. She didn't fit the current mold of what was selling. She was pretty but she wasn't remarkable. Come back later. Come back when you've changed. Come back never. She bleached her hair to a platinum blonde that no one in the world had seen quite like it before. She studied the poses in fashion magazines with an analytical intensity that would have surprised the people rejecting her. She practiced expressions in mirrors for hours. She worked with a determination that was driven not by vanity. She was actually somewhat uncertain about her own appearance, a fact that would surprise almost everyone who met her, but by something far more urgent. She needed to become someone. She needed to exist so fully and so visibly that no institution, no administrator, no practical adult could ever again decide her fate without her permission. Small modeling jobs led to slightly larger ones. The slightly larger ones led to her first real agency contract. The agency contract led to screen tests, and the screen tests, after a series of near misses that would have broken someone with less drive, eventually led to a meeting with 20th Century Fox. They offered her a standard contract. It paid $75 a week, barely livable in Los Angeles. It came with no creative control, no input on casting, no promise of anything beyond the next 6 months. It was the bottom rung of an industry that treated women like inventory. She signed it without a moment's hesitation. The name on that contract was Marilyn Monroe. Monroe from her mother's maiden name, Marilyn chosen for its sound, its music, the way it felt in a mouth. It was a new identity assembled from the fragments of the old one, but for the girl who had spent her whole life being told who she was by whatever institution currently held her, choosing her own name felt like the first truly free act of her life. She had no idea yet that the industry she had just signed herself into would spend the next 15 years deciding who she was allowed to be. That the image they were about to create would eventually become a glass cage she couldn't break out of no matter how hard she tried. But that was still ahead. Right now, she was Marilyn Monroe, and the world was about to find out what that meant. By the early 1950s, something was happening in movie theaters across America that the studio executives at Fox had noticed, though they hadn't quite found the words to explain it yet. Audiences couldn't look away from her. There was a quality in Marilyn Monroe on screen that defied the usual categories. She wasn't just beautiful, Hollywood had no shortage of beautiful women. She wasn't just funny, comedic actresses were a known quantity. What she had was something that operated on a different register entirely, a warmth, a fragility, a kind of playful openness that felt completely unperformed because it was. That softness wasn't a technique she had learned. It was the authentic expression of a woman who had been starved for unconditional love her entire life and had found in the attention of a camera lens the closest thing to it she had ever known. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953 turned her from a rising name into a global phenomenon virtually overnight. Her performance as Lorelei Lee was a masterwork in plain sight, deliberately comic, strategically exaggerated, built on a foundation of sharp intelligence that the majority of critics and audiences missed entirely because the performance was so dazzling on the surface. The sequence where she performed Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend became one of the most replicated images in cinema history. It was copied, referenced, and parodied for decades, which is to say, it entered the culture permanently. How to Marry a Millionaire followed the same year and confirmed that the first film was not a fluke. Then came The 7-Year Itch in 1955, which gave the world one of the most famous images of the entire 20th century. Marilyn standing over a New York subway grate in a white halter dress, the rush of warm air lifting the fabric around her, her head thrown back in laughter. That single image appeared on more walls, more magazine pages, and more pieces of merchandise than almost any photograph taken in the 100 years of cinema. Her personal appearances drew near riots. Ticket lines stretched around city blocks. A 1954 visit to Korea to entertain American troops drew crowds estimated at over 100,000 soldiers at a single performance, a moment she would later describe, with complete sincerity, as the most genuinely loving she had ever felt from any audience. Because it was pure. There was no box office calculation in it, no studio strategy, just 100,000 people happy to see her, in a cold field, in a country at war. She wept afterward, privately, for reasons she struggled to articulate. But behind every one of those luminous public moments was a reality the cameras were never pointed at. She was chronically, legendarily late to sets, sometimes by an hour, sometimes by 3. The studios fumed, directors paced, co-stars ground their teeth in dressing rooms. The press, always happy to reduce complexity to a headline, called it arrogance, called it self-indulgence, called it the predictable behavior of a difficult woman who didn't respect other people's time. What they were not interested in was the truth, which was considerably less dramatic and considerably more painful. She was terrified. Crippling, paralyzing anxiety lived in her body and made the simple act of walking onto a set feel like approaching a precipice. She was convinced in the deepest part of herself that when she got there she would be exposed, that someone would finally look carefully enough to see that she wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't whatever they needed her to be. and the terror of that exposure was sometimes enough to root her to the floor of her dressing room for hours. She required 50 takes, sometimes more, for lines she had rehearsed hundreds of times, not from laziness or contempt for the process. From a perfectionism born of fear, the need to be so thoroughly prepared, so absolutely ready, that humiliation became impossible. The co-stars who complained about her never entirely understood what they were witnessing. They were watching a human being fighting her own nervous system at close range every single day in front of an audience. She was also, in the middle of all this adoration, profoundly and increasingly alone. The studio controlled everything: what she wore, what she said in interviews, which projects she was assigned to, which public persona she was required to perform. Her opinions were not solicited, her intelligence was not consulted, she was an asset in a contract, and the men who held that contract had no particular interest in the inner life of what they were managing. She accepted this because she was still, in some fundamental way, the girl from the orphanage who had learned that the price of staying was compliance. But something was beginning to shift, a quiet, growing refusal. And the men who had controlled her were about to discover that the woman they had been treating as a product had been watching, learning, and building a plan. Joe DiMaggio had been trying to meet Marilyn Monroe for 2 years before they were finally introduced at a dinner in 1952. He was at that point the most celebrated baseball player in American history, a man whose grace on the field had elevated the sport to something approaching art. He was quiet, intensely private. He carried himself with a dignity that the loud, gaudy world of celebrity seemed somehow unable to touch. When he pursued Marilyn Monroe, he did so with the same patient, unwavering focus that had defined his entire career. She was cautious at first, she had no reason to trust easily. But DiMaggio was different from the men who usually orbited her. He seemed to want her company rather than her image. He called when he said he would. He listened when she spoke. He showed up. They married in January of 1954. The public reaction was one of pure delight, the nation's greatest athlete and its most beloved actress, together. A perfect American story. The fault line, however, was already there before the photographs were developed. DiMaggio had fallen in love with the warmth and vulnerability of the real woman beneath the public persona. But the public persona was no longer something Marilyn could simply remove like an evening gown. It had become inseparable from how she moved through the world. Hundreds of thousands of people had a claim on Marilyn Monroe that existed entirely independent of what she or DiMaggio wanted, and those claims were not going away. He hated the roles she played, the movies that displayed her body as a commodity available for public consumption. He hated the studio system's treatment of her, though. Critically, his objection was rooted in possession rather than liberation. He didn't want to free her from the exploitation. He wanted to remove her from a world that was looking at something he considered his. The tension escalated steadily across the first 9 months of their marriage. Every public appearance became a negotiation. Every film role became an argument. Every magazine cover became evidence of a problem that neither of them had the tools to solve. Then came the night in September of 1954 that made the argument impossible to continue. The filming of the famous scene for the 7-Year Itch took place on Lexington Avenue in New York City at 2 in the morning. The director positioned Marilyn over a subway grate. A wind machine was placed below. The white halter dress, carefully chosen for exactly this purpose, caught the rushing air and rose around her. She laughed. The crowd of onlookers and photographers surged forward. The scene was filmed multiple times over several hours. Joe DiMaggio stood in that crowd and watched every take. People who were present that night described his expression with remarkable consistency across subsequent years. It was not rage, it was something worse. A quiet, devastated recognition that the woman he loved belonged, in some irreducible way, to the world, and that the world was not going to give her back. The argument that followed in their hotel room was severe enough to be audible to people in the corridor. Less than a month later, Marilyn Monroe filed for divorce. The marriage had lasted 9 months. And yet DiMaggio's love for Marilyn Monroe never died. He simply carried it differently, privately, quietly, without display. He checked on her. He helped her when the system around her failed. He remained, through every subsequent chapter of her life, the one person she called when the world became too dark to face alone. The reason that matters will become clear very soon, because the moment is coming when she will call him from the darkest place she has ever been, and he will come without being asked twice. If DiMaggio represented the world of sport and silence, Arthur Miller was the world of language and ideas. The playwright behind Death of a Salesman and The Crucible was one of the most serious and celebrated literary figures in mid-century America. He was intellectual, politically engaged, deeply thoughtful. When news spread that he and Marilyn Monroe were involved, the cultural reaction was one of genuine bewilderment mixed with a barely concealed condescension. The press called it Beauty and the Brain, a headline that contained within it the assumption that beauty and brains were mutually exclusive, that Marilyn Monroe could not possibly be interested in ideas rather than simply drawn to the prestige of a famous man. Marilyn didn't care about the headlines. She cared desperately about what the relationship might mean. That a man of Arthur Miller's intelligence and seriousness saw something in her worth pursuing. That she was more than the dress, more than the voice, more than the image the studio had been selling for years. She threw herself into the relationship with an intensity that was almost painful to observe. She converted to Judaism, she attended political events and literary gatherings where she felt profoundly out of her depth, and forced herself to stay anyway. She read voraciously Dostoevsky, Whitman, Joyce, Sandburg, filling the shelves of their shared home with evidence of a mind that had been hungry for engagement its entire life and had never quite been offered the table. She was studying, in a sense, trying to grow into the identity of someone worthy of being Arthur Miller's partner, someone the world would finally be forced to take seriously. And for a time, it produced real fruit. Miller helped her establish Marilyn Monroe Productions, her own production company, giving her creative control over her projects and the power to choose her own material. This was not a small thing. In the Hollywood of the 1950s, female actresses with their own production companies were extraordinary. She used the power wisely. Bus Stop in 1956 produced a performance of such delicate psychological depth that critics who had dismissed her for years fell into an awkward silence. Then came Some Like It Hot in 1959, widely considered one of the greatest comedies in the history of cinema. Her portrayal of Sugar Cane was technically brilliant and emotionally alive in equal measure. She won a Golden Globe. It was the professional peak of her life. But privately, the marriage was fracturing along lines that ran far deeper than anything DiMaggio had inflicted. She suffered multiple miscarriages during the marriage. Each one reached back into her childhood, the longing for family, for belonging, for something that was genuinely permanently hers. Each loss hollowed out another chamber of the hope she had been carrying. She spoke to close friends about the grief with a rawness that frightened them. And then she found the diary. Miller had been keeping private notes, a writer's journal, observations, and reflections. She discovered entries describing her in terms that were not the language of love. She was exhausting, he wrote, neurotic, a weight. He had watched her at her most broken, her most frightened, her most desperately needing, and he had recorded it with the detached analytical eye of a craftsman cataloging material. Those notes were not kept private, they were later incorporated into the screenplay for The Misfits, a film written specifically for her, about a broken woman surrounded by men who mean well and fail her completely. She was his muse, his subject, his material. She had believed she was his partner. The betrayal was profound and total, not violent, just quiet and absolute. The understanding that the most intimate record of her worst moments existed in a drawer somewhere, waiting to be turned into art. They divorced in January 1961, on the very last day of filming The Misfits. That timing was not planned, but it was, in its terrible way, perfect. She was 34 years old. She had been famous for over a decade. She had been married 3 times. She had lost children. She had desperately wanted. And she had just discovered, in the most personal way possible, that the man whose vision of her had sustained her for 5 years had been writing her down in a notebook all along. She returned to Los Angeles. She was more alone than she had ever been, and the machinery that had built her was already preparing its next move. By 1961, the architecture of Marilyn Monroe's daily life had been quietly and completely rebuilt around prescription medication. Sleeping pills to fall asleep, because sleep without chemical assistance had become something her body no longer knew how to find. Stimulants to wake up and function at the level that studios, directors, and a perpetually demanding public required. Barbiturates to quiet the anxiety that lived permanently at the center of her chest, an anxiety that had been there since childhood but had grown, under the compound weight of fame and grief and loss, into something that now had its own gravity. Sedatives to get through the shoots, the interviews, the public appearances, the required smile for a world that wanted her cheerful whether she felt it or not. Doctor after doctor wrote prescriptions and walked away. Nobody sat in the room long enough to ask the one question that mattered. What happens when all of these medications are combined? What does this chemical combination do to a brain that is already fragile, to a nervous system already pushed past its natural limits? What is the end point of this trajectory? The answer was visible to everyone who spent real time with her. Phone calls arriving at 2 and 3 in the morning from a voice with its edges worn away, the forgetting, the sudden distances in the middle of conversations. Friends who had known her for years described watching her disappear, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, like a tide going out. And then, in early 1961, came the moment that stripped away the last pretense of normalcy. Following the collapse of her marriage to Miller and the physical and emotional exhaustion of filming The Misfits, Marilyn Monroe voluntarily admitted herself to a psychiatric clinic in New York. She knew she needed help. She was asking for it. That act of asking took more courage than most people who have never been in that position understand. What happened next was, for her, unspeakable. The clinic placed her in a locked ward. For a woman whose deepest, most foundational childhood terror was ending up like her mother, institutionalized, locked away, erased from the ordinary world, existing in a building that ordinary people walked past without looking, this was not treatment. It was a reenactment of the worst nightmare of her life in clinical lighting. She reportedly screamed, begged, beat her hands against the locked door. The staff, following protocol, did not open it. In a moment of clarity, or perhaps desperation, she managed to reach a phone. She called Joe DiMaggio. He flew from the opposite coast within hours. He walked into the front lobby of that clinic, and in the quiet, immovable way that was entirely characteristic of the man, made clear that Marilyn Monroe was leaving. No press conferences, no dramatic scene, just a presence that communicated, without requiring many words, that this situation was ending. She was transferred to a different facility under better conditions and released within days. DiMaggio had been her ex-husband for nearly 7 years. He came anyway. He always came. She returned to Los Angeles and bought the first home she had ever owned, a small, carefully chosen house in Brentwood, with a Mexican tile courtyard and space for a garden. She decorated it herself. She filled it with the things she loved. She told friends it was going to be the home she had always wanted but never had, the place she was finally going to belong. But the world outside that house had already decided that Marilyn Monroe was becoming a problem. And in Hollywood, problems were managed, not solved. Managed. The year 1962 announced itself with a production that quickly became a slow-motion disaster. Something's Got to Give was supposed to mark Marilyn Monroe's triumphant return, a Fox film, a strong cast, a director with a solid track record. On paper, it was the comeback story the industry was rooting for, at least publicly. In practice, from the very first weeks of production, it was clear that something was badly wrong. She arrived on set late, sometimes by an hour, sometimes by 3, sometimes not at all. The studio's $15 million budget was hemorrhaging through her absences at a rate that made Fox executives visibly ill. The director found himself managing a production that was collapsing in increments, and an actress who, on the days she appeared, was not quite the person who had been hired. Co-stars and crew watched with a mixture of genuine concern and professional frustration. Some tried to speak to the people surrounding her. Some tried to speak to her directly. The response, from the handlers and doctors and managers who formed the wall between Marilyn Monroe and direct communication, was always some variation of, "She's fine. It's just a temporary difficulty. Give us time." Fox was not in a mood to give time. Fox was building a case. Then, in May of 1962, in direct defiance of explicit studio orders forbidding unauthorized absences, Marilyn Monroe flew to New York for a Democratic Party fundraiser at Madison Square Garden. She was going to sing Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy. She was, as had become characteristic, significantly late arriving at the venue. The evening's host, actor Peter Lawford, covered the delay with jokes about her punctuality, jokes that grew thinner as the minutes extended. The audience of 15,000 people began to wonder if she was coming at all. There were rumors in the crowd. She was sick. She wasn't coming. Something had happened. The curtain at the back of the stage moved. She emerged in a gown that had been literally sewn onto her body that afternoon, a sheer flesh-toned Jean Louis creation encrusted with over 2,000 hand-stitched rhinestone crystals. Wearing it, she appeared to be dressed in light itself. She moved to the microphone in the particular way she moved, a combination of genuine physical presence and studied theatrical timing that no acting coach had ever fully taught her, because it was simply how she existed in a room. She paused at the microphone for a long moment. The arena, which had been buzzing with 15,000 voices, went quiet in the specific way that large spaces only go quiet when something is about to happen that cannot be repeated. She sang 12 words of Happy Birthday in a voice that turned the room into something else entirely, intimate, private, devastatingly tender. It wasn't a performance of celebration. It was a performance of longing, wearing the costume of celebration. Everyone in that building felt it, even those who couldn't have said what they were feeling. President Kennedy walked to the microphone afterward, smiled, and told the crowd he could now retire from politics, having had Happy Birthday sung to him in that particular way. The arena erupted. The moment was instantly, permanently iconic. It became one of the most discussed and analyzed minutes of footage from the entire decade. It was also the beginning of the end. Because behind the spectacle of that night was a set of private realities that were about to be brought to a close with a speed and a coldness that nobody who was not inside the situation could have anticipated. Marilyn Monroe's relationships with both John and Robert Kennedy, the nature and depth of which have been the subject of exhaustive investigation and persistent debate, were by the summer of 1962 being deliberately and quietly terminated by the people who managed the political reputations of both men. Phone calls that had been regular became infrequent, then stopped. The access she had to conversations, to people, to a sense of mattering in a world that extended beyond Hollywood, was revoked without ceremony or explanation. Men who had been warm became unreachable. Doors that had been open became closed. She felt discarded. For a woman who had organized the entire architecture of her psychological survival around the terror of abandonment, who had been passed between strangers since childhood, who had built her sense of worth on the validation of others because no unconditional foundation had ever been laid beneath her, this rejection was not merely painful. It struck the deepest possible wound in the deepest possible place. 2 weeks later, 20th Century Fox fired her from Something's Got to Give and launched a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against her. She had never been more alone, and the clock, though none of them knew it yet, was running. The summer of 1962 moved through Marilyn Monroe's life like a fever. Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, was visiting the Brentwood house every single day, a frequency that was not standard practice and that spoke not of routine professional care but of genuine, escalating alarm. Eunice Murray, her housekeeper, had effectively become a residential presence, rarely leaving. The circle of people around Marilyn had contracted to almost nothing. The phone, once ringing constantly with industry calls and social invitations, had grown quieter. The medication consumption had reached a level that should have triggered emergency intervention from any physician paying attention. Chloral hydrate and Nembutal, in the combinations and quantities she was taking, created a chemical environment inside her body and brain that the people closest to her could see but appeared powerless to interrupt. The system that was supposed to protect her was also, by this point, the system enabling the thing that was destroying her. There were moments that shone with the appearance of hope. In late July, she completed a photographic session with photographer Lawrence Schiller that produced some of the most radiant images of her life. She was present, playful, alive, in front of the lens in exactly the way that had made her famous. She spoke about future projects. She spoke about the house, the garden she was going to plant, the things she still wanted to change. She told people close to her that she was going to get better, that things were going to be different. Those photographs are some of the last images taken of her alive. The phone calls at strange hours continued. Friends described a voice that had lost its edges, drifting, blurred, not quite anchored. The quality was different from drunk. It was more fundamental than that. It was a person who had been chemically unmade over a long period of time, and who no longer had a reliable sense of where the boundaries of herself were. On the evening of Saturday, August 4th, 1962, the record shows the following sequence of events, as best as the subsequent investigation could establish, given accounts that shifted, contradicted themselves, and changed significantly over the years that followed. Dr. Grigson visited the house in the early evening and stayed for approximately 2 hours. He would later say that she seemed distressed but not in immediate crisis. He left. Phone calls were made from the house in the hours that followed, calls whose recipients and content were never fully, publicly established, despite years of investigation and speculation. Eunice Murray told police that she had gone to bed and later noticed light under Marilyn's door in the early hours of August 5th. She knocked and received no answer. She called Dr. Greenson, who arrived and broke open the window. The official time of body discovery was reported to authorities as approximately 3:30 in the morning. But here is what has never been satisfactorily explained. Multiple accounts, including Murray's own, which changed significantly in subsequent interviews over the following decades, suggest that Marilyn Monroe was found dead hours earlier than the time officially reported. If that is true, what happened in those intervening hours? Who was called? Who came to the house? What was decided? The coroner ruled the cause of death as probable acute barbiturate poisoning. The manner of death was ruled probable suicide. That word, probable, has never stopped echoing. The official investigation into the death of Marilyn Monroe lasted 4 days. 4 days for the most famous woman in the world. In the decades since, investigators, journalists, former intelligence officials, and people who were in the room on that night have proposed 3 broad explanations, and each one, examined honestly, has something to recommend it. The first is the simplest. Marilyn Monroe, suffering from profound depression and chronic dependency that had been building for years, chose to end her life. She had made at least one previous serious attempt. She was surrounded by people who were failing to help her in the ways she needed. The isolation, the rejection from the Kennedys, the lawsuit from Fox, the loss of the film, any one of these might have been enough. Together they represented a collapse of everything that had been holding her upright. From this view, what happened that night was a tragedy born entirely from the inside. The second theory is accidental overdose. She had been consuming combinations of powerful central nervous system depressants at levels that made a fatal accident not a question of if, but when. On this particular night, the chemistry simply tipped past the point of no return. No intention, just the inevitable mathematics of a dependency that had been allowed to accelerate, unchecked, for years by doctors who should have intervened, by handlers who chose not to see, by a system that needed her functional but never healthy. The third theory is darker and harder to dismiss outright, no matter how uncomfortable it is to take seriously. FBI files on Marilyn Monroe, declassified and released under the Freedom of Information Act, confirmed that she had been under active government surveillance for years. Her political associations, her access to the Kennedy brothers, and the possibility that she might speak publicly about those relationships made her a subject of active monitoring by federal agencies. There is documented evidence that conversations inside her home were recorded. There is testimony from people in her immediate circle, including her publicist, who went on record years later that she had spoken of going public with information, that she was angry, that she was not willing to simply disappear quietly. None of this has been proven as direct evidence of foul play. The conspiracy theories that have gathered around her death range from the carefully argued to the demonstrably absurd, and they should not all be treated with equal seriousness. But the unanswered questions are real. The shifting timeline is real. The strange delay in notifying authorities is real. The phone records pointing in certain directions are real. And this is real. Marilyn Monroe was a deeply vulnerable woman encircled by a system, medical, political, industrial, that consistently prioritized its own interests over her survival. Whether her death was a choice, an accident, or something more deliberate, the conditions that made it possible were constructed by forces far larger and more powerful than herself. She didn't die alone by coincidence. She died alone because the world had spent 36 years deciding, in small ways and large, that her inner life was less important than her image. Here is what the mythology almost always loses. Marilyn Monroe was genuinely, seriously intelligent. She owned hundreds of books and read them with real attention. Dostoevsky's novels were her frequent companions. Joyce's complexity didn't intimidate her. Whitman's expansiveness spoke to something in her. She took notes in margins. She returned to difficult passages. She was the kind of reader who argued with authors silently on public transportation and emerged from bookshops an hour later than intended. She studied acting at the Actors Studio in New York, the same institution where Marlon Brando and James Dean sharpened their craft. Her teacher, Lee Strasberg, said, not once in passing, but repeatedly, to serious people asking serious questions, that she was among the greatest natural acting talents he had ever encountered. This was not a compliment offered to generate publicity. Strasberg was notoriously sparing with praise. He meant it as a technical assessment. She was also genuinely, intelligently funny. Not decoratively funny, not funny in the way beautiful women are sometimes described as funny, when what people mean is that they don't mind listening to them. Funny in the way that requires precise timing and acute understanding of human behavior, and the ability to make an audience feel that they are in on something rather than being performed at. The comedy in her best films doesn't operate through her appearance. It operates through intelligence and instinct, working in perfect concert. She was generous in ways that were never publicized because she insisted they not be. She remembered the names of crew members on films she had made years earlier. She asked after people's families and actually listened to the answers. She sent flowers and gifts to people going through difficulty and asked that there be no mention of it. She was also profoundly, fundamentally damaged. The childhood she had survived had left her with an appetite for love so enormous and so unappeasable that no human relationship could ever fully satisfy it. She needed constant reassurance, not from vanity, but from a genuine inability to believe in the absence of ongoing evidence that she was still loved. She could be overwhelmingly present in relationships, filling every available space with a neediness that came from the deepest place of her history. And then, when the fear peaked, she would disappear. She was, beneath everything, simply human. Extraordinarily, brilliantly, achingly human in a profession and a culture that needed her to be something more manageable than that. More 60 years after her death, Marilyn Monroe's face appears on walls in cities she never visited, in countries that didn't exist when she was alive. Andy Warhol turned her image into some of the most celebrated art of the 20th century, silk-screened, color-shifted, repeated until the repetition itself became the meaning. Those works have sold for hundreds of millions of dollars, but look at them carefully and they are, at their core, a meditation on exactly what consumed her, the reduction of a human being to a flat, repeated image. The art that made her immortal did so by doing precisely what killed her. She has been portrayed, analyzed, biographized, and reimagined in film and literature so many times that the fictional versions have almost overtaken the real one. Every generation produces a new interpretation and argues about it. We are still not agreed on how to represent her. We are still not certain we understand what we're looking at when we look at her. That difficulty is not incidental, it is the point. Her impact on popular culture is beyond measurement. She defined a specific mode of female celebrity, one built on a foundation of visibility, vulnerability, and a particular kind of availability to the public gaze that subsequent generations of women have both drawn on and struggled against. The question she raises, simply by having existed and been consumed the way she was, is one that every famous woman since has had to answer in her own way. How do you remain a person inside an image? Many have tried, many have failed. The machinery has not changed as much as we sometimes like to tell ourselves. Every decade rediscovers Marilyn Monroe and finds in her story something that feels urgent and contemporary, because the forces that made and unmade her, the beauty standards, the institutional power of men, the willingness of a culture to consume a person's pain as entertainment while calling it admiration, those forces have not been retired. The names change, the platforms change, the essential shape of the story keeps repeating. At the Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, there is a small marble crypt with a simple brass plaque. Marilyn Monroe. Hong 26, 1962. For 20 years after her death, fresh roses appeared at that crypt 3 times a week every week without fail. Joe DiMaggio arranged them. He kept that quiet commitment until the day he died in 1999. He never gave a public explanation. He never remarried. The roses were the explanation. She lived 36 years. She appeared in 30 films. She was photographed an estimated 2 million times. She was desired and discussed and mythologized and consumed by a world that could not get enough of her image, and that was persistently, almost constitutionally, uninterested in the person generating it, in the horror, and yet she spent most of her life feeling like she belonged to no one. The girl from the Los Angeles orphanage who promised herself the whole world would know her name got exactly what she asked for. The tragedy, the deepest, most heartbreaking layer of it, is that getting it didn't give her what she actually needed. She needed to be loved, simply, quietly, unconditionally loved. Not the love of crowds or cameras or powerful men who eventually, always, close their doors. The ordinary staying love that the little girl staring at the orphanage ceiling had looked for in the faces of strangers. The love that kept not coming. She was the most wanted woman in the world. She died alone. And in that gap between the most wanted and the most alone lives the full devastating truth of her story. A truth that belongs not only to Marilyn Monroe, but to every brilliant, broken human being that the world has ever preferred as an image rather than as a person. Gacho will always remember the white dress and the breathless voice and the smile that stopped traffic on every street encountered. But those who look closer, who read her letters, who listen to the recordings, who study the photographs taken when she didn't know anyone was watching, will find something else. A woman who built herself from almost nothing, who was talented far beyond what the world ever allowed her to demonstrate, who fought, in her complicated and deeply human way, to be taken seriously, to have authorship over her own story, to become more than the image that had been decided for her by people who never asked what she wanted. She didn't fully succeed. The forces against her were too powerful, too numerous, too deeply embedded in the culture of the time. But she tried, and the trying mattered. In the end, the empire of glamour and desire and fame that was built around Norma Jean Mortensen could not protect the real person living inside it, could not quiet the fear that had lived in her since the orphanage, could not fill the space that had been empty since childhood, could not keep the darkness from eventually winning. But for 36 years she kept showing up. She kept walking into rooms where she wasn't taken seriously and finding a way to be impossible to ignore. She kept reaching for something better, something truer, something more fully herself, right up until the very end. That is why more than 60 years later we are still here talking about her. That is why the roses kept coming.